Ohr Somayach is a beautiful example of love of Hashem, love of Torah, love of Am Yisrael. And that is something we absolutely need all the time. That's going to bring Mashiach. And we especially need it at a time of war, at a time of danger, at a time when, frankly, lives could be lost, chas v'shalom. So I turn to our dear friends, who are both Yisachars and Zevulun's, to generously support an institution. For 50 years, there's a record of success. And without your help, we're not going to be able to do it. So in the merit of your support of Torah, your support of Ohr Somayach, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu bless you and your families with all of the brachos that Hashem gives to those who support the Torah. And in the merit of that limud HaTorah, may Klal Yisrael and the world merit shalom, peace, tranquility, and may this bring us ever closer to the Geula Shalema B'mheira B'yameinu. Megillas Ruth, the book of Ruth, and the pasuk, as I told you, the Gemara in Rav Basra says that Megillas Ruth was written by Shmuel Hanavi, and although the Gemara does not give us the reason why he wrote it, but as I indicated, the Meforshim say, it was ultimately to legitimate the yichus and the kashrus of David HaMelech. That was one of Shmuel's last activities. Now, it begins with a dating. It's telling you when did this story occur. So, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Aleph says, Vayhi bimei shafayit hashayftim. It happened in the days of the judges judging. Now, that's not a very good dating system. The period of the Shoftim is over 300 years. So it's like I'm writing a history, I'm trying to tell you when something happened. I say, it happened between the 1600s and the 1900s. You know, it's not too much of a dating. So what is the purpose of saying it was in the days Shvot HaShoftim? So the Gemara has a drasha that Shvot HaShoftim does not mean when the judges were judging, but it means when the judges were being judged. Shvot HaShoftim, when they were being judged. Meaning it's describing not a date, it's describing a spiritual atmosphere in which even the so-called leaders were so corrupt that people were judging them. So the Gemara gives an expression that if a judge would tell you, a rabbi, a teacher would tell you, take away the splinter that's in your teeth, you would answer back, take away the beam that's in your eye, meaning to say, whatever you're telling me, you're worse. Now, that itself can be understood in two ways. Is it a genuine taina that the leadership was corrupt? Or does it mean the people were so corrupt that they didn't have respect for their leaders? In other words, the Gemara itself is not really clear if the point is a condemnation of the leadership or a condemnation of the people who denigrated their leadership. But either way, it was a spiritually weak time. It was a weak time, a time that needed chizuk. And that will explain some of the events that happened. So during that time, which again, could be a long period of time, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Beis Lechem, Yehuda, right? Beis Lechem is where Kever Rachel is, Beis Lechem, Bethlehem. And the reason why it's called Beis Lechem Yehuda is simply because it indeed is situated in the tribal inheritance of Yehuda. There was a man who left Beis Lechem because of the famine, Lagor b'Shtei Moav. He crossed the Yarden to live in the fields of Moab. He and his wife and his two sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. His two sons are Machlain v'Chilyain. I'll come back to all of these. And they came to the field of Moab. And then, one after another, a lot of tragedies happen. Elimelech dies. And Naomi is left alone as a widow with her two sons. And the two sons marry Moabite women. One is Orpah and one is Ruth. And they live there for 10 years. And eventually, presumably after the 10 years, Both Machlon and Chilion died, and the woman was bereft of both her children and her husband. So let's stop right. So that's kind of the beginning of the story, although it already covers a 10-year period. A woman, her husband, and her 2 children come to Moab because of a famine in the land. Husband dies first. The 2 children, they're adults, marry Moabite women. The 2 sons died, leaving Naomi a widow who lost her children, and she has her 2 daughters-in-law, and she's going to go back to Eretz Israel. And as you know, Orpah does not go back, Ruth goes back. Okay, now let's stop there. First of all, the Gemara in Bava Basra comments that Elimelech did a very bad thing in leaving Eretz Israel. And there are a few different reasons that are given for that sin. One is you don't leave Eretz Israel for virtually any reason, unless the famine is so serious that it's a matter of life and death, and apparently it was not that. He was serious, but it was not a matter of life and death. Right? We know the famous halacha: one is allowed to leave Eretz Israel to learn Torah, if there are no yeshivas, which obviously is not true here, to find a wife, to make a parnasa. But generally speaking, one is not allowed to leave Eretz Israel. In fact, the interesting thing is, you're certainly not allowed to move back unless you fall under those heterim. Are you allowed to take trips? So the Emma says we're very mako on taking trips. That's why you go visit your parents or whatever it is. But there were many, many Gedolim who actually took the position you weren't even allowed to make a trip. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach had grandchildren who were being married in England. He did not go to the chasna. He says he does not leave Eretz Israel. So without getting into the halachas, according to one opinion in the Gemara, Elimelech died. Elimelech died because he left Eretz Israel without justification. There is, however, another view in the Gemara that Elimelech's sin was not so much leaving Eretz Israel, but it was the reason. Elimelech was a wealthy man. Elimelech had resources to share. He didn't want so many demands being made on his resources. He left because he didn't want to give up his wealth to help all the poor people. In fact, the Meforshim say that's why he chose Moab, because Moabites understand that philosophy. They didn't want to share their food and water, so he figured the Moabites understand where I'm coming from. So he went to Moab. So we have a machlokes. Elimelech was considered to be a tzaddik, but his avera was either leaving Eretz Yisrael or his avera was sorus ayin. And because he was a tzaddik, Hashem held him to a higher standard than he would hold most of us, and that is why he died. In fact, the Ramban says, if you remember, when there was a famine in Eretz Yisrael, Avraham Avinu went to Mitzrayim, and that's when Paro wanted to take Sarah. The Ramban writes, although the Chumash doesn't say it was a sin, the Ramban writes that according to his opinion, Avraham Avinu himself committed an avera by leaving Eretz Yisrael, even in a time of famine. All right, that's something to think about generally. Now, who was Elimelech? So it's interesting that the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, Elimelech, Salmon. Now, Salmon is the father of Boaz, if you remember that. So Elimelech, Salmon, the father of Boaz, and Tov, that's the other relative that's in the scene, who was offered the ability to marry Ruth. He's going to be mentioned in Perek Dalet. His name is either Tov or Ploni Almoni. We'll get to that. But these 3 people, Elimelech, Salmon, and Tov, are brothers, and they are all the sons. We know Salmon is a son of Nachshon ben Aminadab. That the pasuk says. But Elimelech and I'm sorry, this is Elimelech, Salmon, and Tov. Tov and Elimelech are all brothers, and they're all the sons of Nachshon ben Aminadav. Okay, so they come from a very, very righteous family. Okay, so that's why Elimelech died. Sorosayan or leaving Eretz Yisrael. Then it says the two sons married Moabite women. And the two Moabite women are Ruth and Orpah. I told you yesterday that Ruth and Orpah are actually sisters, and they are the daughters of a king of Moab, Eglon Melech Moab, who was killed by an earlier Shofet, Ehud ben Gera. Okay, that's fine. But here's the central question. Did they marry non-Jewish women? Or did Ruth and Orpah convert? How do we understand the narrative here? Did they marry non-Jewish women? Not allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman. Remember the whole discussion we had yesterday that only the male Moabite is forbidden, not the female. That's talking about when they converted. If they didn't convert, they're non-Jews. Yeah.
Well, if they were killed by their father was killed by Yeshivat, maybe we can assume that was in a war, and then the halachas of like taking a prisoner of war, female captive, and then marrying her.
You're saying Ruth and Orpah were Eshes Shefas Torah. Well, yeah, I think. I mean, listen, that's a very imaginative idea. I don't think it's described as going through any type of process of Yefas Torah, and it doesn't really say the idea of the private assassination of the king of Moab by Ehud was not described as a full-fledged war in any event. Yeah.
Is the death of their father probably what time period?
Yeah, so the truth is, there is a Shofet in the book of Shoftim whose name is Iftzan, and very little is said about him. According to Chazal, Iftzan is Boaz. Now, if that is the case, then Iftzan is several Shoftim after Ehud ben Gera, who killed Eglon. So we have to assume that Ruth and Orpah are already orphans. Now, were they living in a palace? I don't know the succession idea. In other words, if Eglon Melech Moav got killed, were Ruth and Orpah still in a royal environment? It's not clear. Chazal seem to say yes. Chazal always described them as princesses, even though their father was assassinated. Their father was killed.
Boaz was already very old. How old were?
And Boaz was very old. Yeah. Well, Boaz is very old, but Boaz is older than Machlon Bechil. Machlon Bechil, well, no. At this point, Boaz is not necessarily that old either. Remember, this is before they come back to Eretz Yisrael, right? And they're there for 10 years, etc. So this is 10 years, at least 10 years before Boaz is going to marry Ruth. Okay. So there's a huge machlokas if Machlon V'Chilya married non-Jewish women, or somehow Ruth and Orpah underwent a conversion. Now let me give you the arguments pro-con in terms of understanding the narrative. First, we have a Targum on the book of Ruth. Now the Targum is not Targum Onkelos. We actually don't know who wrote the Targum on the Megillas. We know the following. We know that the primary Targum on the Torah, the Aramaic translation, is Onkelos, who was a ger. Onkelos was actually a non-Jew who converted to Judaism. The Targum on the books of the Nevi'im is Targum Yonasan ben Uziel. Yonasan ben Uziel was a Talmud of Hillel. He was considered to be the greatest Talmud of Hillel. There's many legends about him. The Talmud mentions that when he would learn, the Malachi Yashares would come over his head. So if a bird would fly over, they would be burnt in the fire of his learning. In fact, the Welt likes to say that the difference between a chassid and a misnaged is how do you interpret the story of Yonas ben Uziel. When you hear the story, a bird flew over his head and got burnt. What is it that you think about? So a Hasidic heart would say, look at how great a human being can become. Look at the godless of your Torah. You're greater than a malach. The malachim come in jealousy to see your Torah. Look at the closeness to Hashem you can achieve. Right? A chassid is inspired by this story. I matter. I make a difference. I'm not a nobody, at least potentially. The misnaged, who always worries about technical halacha, says, if the bird belonged to somebody, does Yonas ben Uziel have to pay damages for the burning of the bird, right? So misnaged tends to always kind of focus on the halachic aspect. But be it as it may, there is another Messiah that for whatever reason, I don't know what the reason would be, Yonas ben Uziel did not marry and died without children. He is buried in Amuka, a very deep valley near Tzfat. And you may have heard that to this very day, going to the kever of Yonas ben Uziel in Tzfat, and not in Tzfat, in Amuka, is said to be a good skula for shidduchim. Somehow, because he knows what it's like to be alone, his tefillos have a special power in that area. And often what happens is, intentionally or unintentionally, people leave lost sidurim behind with their name, address, email, and WhatsApp. And members of the other gender who want to be Makayim, the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, will contact the person who lost their siddur. And I'm told that more than one shidduch has been made by the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda and the like. But it is considered to be a school. I remember many, many years ago going to Amuka. I think I was already married, but I went to Amuka. And in those days, there were no lights. So really, it was kind of total pitch black darkness. And it was a very dangerous bus ride going back and forth, down this treacherous valley. But the one thing about Amuka is you really see, not like in any dark valley, you literally see, millions of stars, because you always wonder, Hashem says to Abraham, your children will be like the stars of the heaven. So I look up at the sky here, I see like 5 stars if I'm lucky. You don't see so many stars. But the truth is, they're all there. If you don't have light pollution, there literally is billions, not millions and millions of stars. And in Amuka, you actually saw all of the stars. But this is the kever of Yonas ben Uziel. Now, the Gemara in Megillah says that Yonas ben Uziel wrote a Targum on Nevi'im, and then he was going to write a Targum on Kesuvim. But when he got to the pasuk, the Daniel, he was going to, remember we learned Daniel, he was going to explain the exact dates when Mashiach is going to come. So Hashem made a tremendous earthquake. He was going to destroy. This is not to be revealed. So the Gemara says, Beferish, Yonas ben Uziel did not write a Targum on Kesuvim. Now, the truth is, though, we do have a Targum on the Megillos, so we don't know who wrote it, but it is from the time of the Tanoim. One other thing, just as a side point, the Gemara says Onkelos wrote the Targum on the Torah, and Yonas ben Uziel wrote the Targum on the Nevi'im. The Kesuvim is unknown. So the question is, if you open up a Mikros Gedolos, open up a Chumash with Meforshim, so you'll see Targum Onkelos, but you'll also see something called Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, which is much less literal than Onkelos. It incorporates a lot of midrashim and the like. But if the author is Yonas ben Uziel, does that not contradict the Gemara that says Yonas ben Uziel only wrote on Nevi'im and Onkelos wrote on the Torah? So there are 2 ways of understanding it. Some say, well, Yonas ben Uziel did write on the Torah too, but the Gemara means the Iker Targum of the Torah. The most authoritative Targum is Onkelos, and the most authoritative Targum of Nevi'im is Yonasan. Others say that it's a misattribution, that in point of fact, Yonas ben Uziel is not the author of a Targum on the Torah, and that's why in scholarly literature, it is often referred to as pseudo Yonasan. You might have seen that designation. So it's still a holy sefer. It's still from the Tanoim, but perhaps the attribution to Yonasan ben Uziel is incorrect. Okay, that's a digression. But the reason I'm bringing it up is that the Targum of Ruth says Machlein and Chilyain died because they married non-Jewish women. So, not Moab. Again, Moabite is not a problem. You're allowed to marry female Moabite converts. The problem is they didn't convert. So the Targum on Megillas Ruth absolutely says that the Aveira of Machlon v'Chilyon was intermarriage. And even though normally, unfortunately, people don't die from it, but they were tzaddikim. But again, it's a strange thing. They were tzaddikim, they intermarried. How could they intermarry? How could they do it? Right? So that's going to be difficult. I also want to point out, we're going to see weiter, we're going to see further on, that Rashi says the same thing, although he doesn't quote the Targum. Rashi says, both Ruth and Orpah were Nochriot. They were non-Jewish women. Machlon v'Chilyain married non-Jewish women. Now, this does explain, if you assume they're non-Jewish women, the big problem you have is, how could these righteous people do this, Aveira? Okay. But this does explain why Naomi, Ruth and Orpah want to go back with her initially, and Naomi says, don't go back, don't go back, don't go back. And Orpah finally turns away, and Ruth comes. Now, Naomi is discouraging them from coming. Now, if they converted, they're Jewish. How could she encourage them to leave her? If they're not yet Jewish, and Orpah never became Jewish, and Ruth became Jewish, then we understand this is the ritual that when somebody wants to convert to Judaism, you initially try to discourage them, to test their sincerity. So in many, many ways, the whole idea, the whole shakla v'tarya of Naomi trying to discourage them from following her fits very well if you assume that both Ruth and Orpah are not Jewish at this point. And Ruth, converts. How did she convert? We'll discuss that, but she converts only in the process of coming with Naomi. So that's fine. Where you get into a real problem is that, I'm getting ahead of myself, but just to give you the background, is the story in the last parak is very inexplicable. The story of Boaz marrying Ruth is presented as a type of yibum idea, that you will be perpetuating the neshama of Machlon. Right? Well, how does the Torah describe yibum? The Torah describes yibum as a man dies without children, so his brother should marry the widow to perpetuate the neshama of the deceased. There is a real sense, particularly the way Kabbalah explains it, that the child that is born from yibum is spiritually a perpetuation of the soul of the one who died without children. That's what yibum is. Yibum is about perpetuating the neshama of a man who was taken from the world without having any continuity. That's why Chalitza has that derision to it. When they don't do yibum and she takes off his shoe and she spits in front of him, not in his face, in front of him. And what does she say? So shall be done to the man who does not want to rebuild his brother's home. Now, the marriage of Ruth and Boaz is presented as yibum, even though it's not halachic yibum, because, again, based on what I told you, what is the relationship of Boaz to Machlon v'Chilyon? They are actually cousins. Remember, Boaz's father, Salmon, is Elimelech's brother. Salmon and Elimelech are brothers. Boaz is Salmon's son. Machlon and Chilyon, actually it's only Machlon because Chilyon, there's no yibum for Chilyon, because Orpah didn't go back. But Machlon and Chilion are the sons of Elimelech. So what is the relationship of Boaz to Machlon and Chilion? They are first cousins, not brothers, right? Everyone got that. First cousins, all right? So technically, there is no halachic yibum for a cousin to marry his cousin's widow. Halachic yibum is only to marry your brother's widow. But the Ramban is masbir that even though the mandatory part of yibum is only a brother, but the spiritual idea of yibum can apply to all relatives. There is some inyan for a cousin to marry a cousin's widow, because that is a way of perpetuation. So the point basically is that if you look at Perek Dalet, the whole setup of why Boaz should marry Ruth, it is described in Yibum language as a way of perpetuating Machlon's soul. Okay, we'll call that non-halachic Yibum or spiritual Yibum. But here's the problem. Yibum only makes sense when there was a marriage. I mean, if a brother was living with a woman without marriage, and then he died, there's certainly no concept of Yibum there. Now, if Ruth is now Jewish, yeah, Ruth is Jewish now. By the end of the story, she's Jewish. But if you're going to tell me, when she was married to Machlon was Ruth's husband, she was not Jewish. And Machlon died because he had married a guy. Why would there be any concept of Yibum for Boaz, his cousin, to marry the widow? That only makes sense if Ruth was already Jewish. So the point is, we got problems either way you look at it. If Ruth and Orpah are both not Jewish, how do we explain the Yibum idea of Boaz marrying Ruth? And if you're going to tell me Ruth and Orpah were Jewish, they converted, although where was the basin? I don't know, but they converted, then why is Naomi urging both of them to go back? Which would only make sense if they weren't Jewish. So essentially, you got two problems, meaning the idea of Naomi trying to send them back would indicate they're not Jewish. The idea of Yibum would indicate they did convert, they were Jewish, or at least Ruth converted. And anyway, there's certainly no indication in the text that Ruth converted and Orpah didn't. I mean, we know later Orpah didn't come and Ruth came, but in Moab, there is no indication Ruth and Orpah were any different in that way. Okay, so this is kind of a major issue in how to understand the story, because you have a problem either way you look at it. So interestingly enough, we have an interesting yishuv, an interesting teretz from the Zayar Chadash, from the Zayar. Right? If you're familiar with the Zayar, so there's the Zohar, and then there's something called Zayar Chadash, New Zayar. What is New Zayar? So it's not what it sounds like. New Zohar sounds like something that was written later than the original Zohar. That's not really the case. We believe the whole Zohar is connected to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Zohar Chadash just means it was a part of the Zohar that was printed later. So it's only Chadash in the sense that it was not printed in the original Zohar, it was added later, but the Zohar Chadash has the same authority as the Zohar. Now, this is to be contrasted with the Ramchal. The Ramchal actually was writing a new Zohar, but he burnt it. So we don't have the Ramchal's new Zohar. But the Zohar Chadash is really just part of the Zohar. And the Zohar Chadash makes the following interesting arguments. There actually is a halacha that we're not going to be makabel gerim when Mashiach comes. When Mashiach comes, and people, at that point, being a Jew is a good thing. Everyone's going to want to be Jewish. The gates are closed. If you want to convert, you got to convert now. But I still get the shaila about people who are in the pipeline of Geras, and things take long sometimes. So they say, what's going to be? Mashiach is going to come and I'm not going to be able to convert? So the answer is, if you're in the pipeline, we'll finish it. You're not going to be excluded. But if you didn't have the desire to convert until Mashiach comes, we don't take you. And the reason is very obvious, because there's a very good reason to doubt sincerity. You want to become Jewish because Mashiach, etc. Similarly, the Gemara says, we were not supposed to be Makabel Gerim in the days of David HaMelech and in the days of Shlomo HaMelech, because that is when Jewish power was at its height. In other words, we accept Gerim when it's hard to be a Jew, when Jews are hated. So somebody wants to become a Jew, they're probably very sincere, because it's not a natural thing to want to do. They're doing it for spiritual reasons. But when Jews have power and authority, we don't accept. So the Rambam is Masber. This is actually the explanation for Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech married 1,000 wives. And some of the wives were very, very bad influences. Married Paro's daughter. She brought idols into the house, etc. How do you understand this? Shlomo HaMelech, is Shlomo HaMelech a tzaddik or Shlomo HaMelech a rasha? How do we look at Shlomo HaMelech? The wisest of all people. We have 3 of his Sfarim in Tanakh. We have Mishlei, the book of wisdom. Shir HaShirim, the book of ecstatic love of Hashem. We have Koheles, a reflection on life and the need to live a spiritual life. If he would have been a rasha, we wouldn't have included 3 of his books in that. So we consider Shlomo HaMelech a righteous man. So what is it? He's marrying all these non-Jewish women. So the Rambam is Masber. The Zohar does not quote the Rambam, obviously, but it says an idea that is the same as that which the Rambam says, that Avada, these women underwent conversion. And it was a halachically valid conversion. But Shlomo HaMelech did commit one sin. He shouldn't have facilitated their conversion. Because in the days of Shlomo, you have to question sincerity. And the proof of the pudding that he shouldn't have converted them was the fact that they reverted to their idolatrous ways. And in such a situation, retroactively, their conversion was seen not to be sincere. So yes, they actually were non-Jewish. But Shlomo rationalized to himself they underwent a conversion. So what is the idea here? That when people convert in times and places that we shouldn't accept them, if they later behave in a way that's inconsistent with mitzvos, that shows us the conversion was not sincere. Now, again, let me emphasize the point here. If a person converts to Judaism, and later they become non-religious, that does not invalidate their conversion. It's very important to know that. The same way that a born Jew can go off the derech, and they're still a Jew, a converted Jew can go off the derech and still be a Jew. Okay, there is no such thing as invalidating a conversion because the ger later became not religious. But that's only true if we can assume that they were sincere at the time they converted. But if their behavior later shows us that they were not sincere even at the time, the conversion is invalid. You see the difference? Now, this is very subtle. How do you know? A guy converts and he's later Mechalel Shabbos. How do I know that that means he wasn't sincere all the way back? Or maybe he was sincere and he just went off the derech. Okay, it's very crucial. So one way we measure it is simply a matter of time, meaning the following. Let's say he converts at 1 p.m. Friday afternoon, and he violates the first Shabbos. So there it's fairly safe to say he never meant it. The other extreme, he kept Shabbos faithfully for 10 years. Right, so sometimes, and obviously there are things in the middle. What if after 2 weeks, But one of the things we look at is how soon after his conversion did he commit Averos? This is a real question. I mean, by the way, this is a very, very, very relevant question in Eretz Israel, with many Russian conversions that may not have been sincere, etc. And the press misreports it. The press, the Jerusalem Post or secular newspapers, will often say the Rabbanut retroactively invalidated conversions because the converts stopped being Orthodox. That is absolutely false. You cannot invalidate a conversion just because somebody stopped being Orthodox. What you can do is, if it can be established, which may be very hard, that the later behavior indicates there was a lack of sincerity in the beginning, then there never was a conversion, because one of the requirements of conversion is a sincere acceptance of mitzvahs. So what the Zohar and what the Rambam are suggesting is that when you were converted at a time when there is real reasons to suspect insincerity, the days of David, Shlomo, Mashiach, then your later behavior will be an indicator that your conversion was not sincere. So here's what the Zohar says. We will assume that Machlon and Chilyon would never have married Goyim. They wouldn't have done that. We will assume that Ruth and Orpah underwent a conversion process. Although we'd have to know, where was the base then? Were there other people? I don't know how they did it, but they did it. But they shouldn't have been accepted because Elimelech was a very, very prominent citizen, kind of almost like the royalty, the aristocracy. And therefore, there are reasons to say that maybe royalty, especially now that they lost their father, maybe they wanted to attach themselves to royalty. So the litmus test is, will they continue to be sincere when they lose that royalty? Elimelech died. Machlon v'Chilyon died. Naomi is now a poor widow with no family connections. So she's testing her daughters-in-law to see if their original conversion was sincere. Orpah, who went back, that indicates she only converted for the status. Ruth, who didn't come back, shows, in other words, it's not that Ruth converted when she went with Naomi. Ruth demonstrated that her conversion was sincere all the way back. So this is a brilliant answer. Meaning, Orpah, whose conversion was not sincere, was never married to Chilyon because she was a guy. Ruth, who demonstrated her conversion was sincere, was retroactively married to Machlon, and that's why there's a concept of spiritual yibum at the end of the book. So Naomi discouraging them is not the discouragement that you do to a non-Jew who wants to become Jewish. Both of them underwent conversion, but it's the discouraging you do to test how sincere the conversion was when the conversion might have been motivated by ulterior circumstances. So do you hear the chiddush of the Zohar Chadash in understanding this story? Now again, as I say, the Targum absolutely says that they were non-Jewish, and so does Rashi, and there's a real problem. It's a real tzorechiyun as to how to understand the concept of yibum, even though it's not halachic yibum, but spiritual yibum or non-halachic yibum that is presented in Perek Dalet. Yeah.
That logic, don't we say that when you convert, you now have a Jewish soul? So if it was it wasn't a sincere conversion. They never had a Jewish soul.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. Meaning we make certain assumptions, but later events can prove that our assumption was incorrect.
And then, does that mean retroactive? You have to everything that they were a part of. Now you have to overturn. What if they were a witness in a wedding?
Well, yeah, a woman wouldn't be a witness, but your question, yeah, I understand. Yeah, the answer is yeah. According to this svara, the kedushin would be puzzled. The edus would be no good. By the way, this was a real, not this particular problem, but we had a similar problem here in Ramat Eshkol a few years ago. There was a couple, I think I may have mentioned this in the Q&A, who were integrated into the Haredi community, and it turned out that they were Messianic Jews. They were Jews, maybe not even Jewish, I'm not sure, Jews for Jesus, etc. And this guy was so well integrated. He was a shochet. I mean, to me, he was a shochet. He was a moel. He was an aide. He wrote Gittin. It's like, you have to go back like 1,000 things and examine like every marriage, every divorce, every animal, and people have to conjure their kitchens. So yeah, sometimes we do have these problems where Lamafreya, things all have to be re-examined. Yeah.
This sincerity test, is that just Nasir, or are they certain mitzvahs that what's the food?
No, it's really a sincerity test. It's not really a knowledge test so much. It's really to gauge how sincere they are. Yeah.
Question. If a lady is converting because she's pregnant by a Jew, she's pregnant, she wants to convert and like make a family, she's not necessarily sincere at the time of conversion, but like throughout the process of them having the family, she's like, wow, I'm actually getting connection with Hashem and stuff. Would that be considered as sincere?
Yeah. So again, b'diavad that would be a conversion. Again, see, you have to understand this. Even if a person converts in order to marry somebody, that doesn't mean the conversion is not sincere. A person may still sincerely want to keep the mitzvos, even if they have an ulterior motive. They're not doing it for God, but they are sincere in their commitment to keep the Torah. I didn't. Yeah.
Could we assume that there was some kind of community there? You asked a question.
And you're asking how they converted. Yeah. So my assumption is, I just don't know. My assumption is that Elimelech relocated with a community, meaning it wasn't just 3 people or 4 people in Moab. First of all, that would have been extremely dangerous. Remember, Moab is largely hostile to us. So it's kind of, moving to, moving to Gaza, whatever it would be. It's not well advised. But the assumption would be that he came with the community, and there may have been Talmidei Chachamim, there as well, who could facilitate a gerus. Yeah.
In the case of spiritual yibum, not halachic yibum, where there isn't an inherent issur to the relations, could then you marry that person and have more children by them who are considered yours? Like if you engage in relations for the sake of spiritual yibum, are you then forbidden to marry them?
Well, first of all, when you engage in either spiritual yibum or halachic yibum, you actually are married to them. Yibum is a marriage. It is a marriage. But you're asking me who kind of owns the children. It's an interesting thing. I mean, logically, I would have said the yavam is, but yet you see from the end of Ruth that this spiritual yibum it becomes like Machlon's son. So, I mean, both are true. I mean, listen, even a yavam son, it doesn't mean there's no mitzvah of kibbud aviyah. He is your son, but spiritually there's a certain connection. Yeah.
That sincerity that you said about the situation where B'diavad, she converted for, let's say, her husband or whatever
Yeah.
Right? And she became sincere after because she started keeping the halachas and everything.
Yeah.
And then later on, she's like, I'm not really sincere about it because why am I keeping this? I don't like she loses the sincerity basically. In that case where she loses sincere in the beginning process of the conversion, does it lose?
There may be some real problems. Meaning, it's one thing if you're sincere at the time of conversion and then you leave it, you're still good. But if you weren't sincere, became sincere, and then left it, I think there's a real shaila there, whether she would remain Jewish under those circumstances. But again, I do want to underscore that other than this particular unusual situation, the mere fact that a ger stops being religious does not invalidate the conversion. It's very important that you know that, because the newspapers and the articles online and otherwise are always saying the opposite, and that is absolutely not the case. Okay, be well.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.